Luke 16. And the first time we heard it from the NRS, oh, let me turn that on, you're right. I almost stabbed myself in the thumb twice trying to put this thing on, and then I don't hit the on button. This one's good, right? We're green. We should be on. Sound good? So we're going to try. Ooh, yep, we're hot. We did the NRSV for the first reading, and now we're going to try and the New International Version for the second attempt at this parable. And like I said, even Brad and I were just talking about it a second ago. As we read it aloud, you're like, I don't think I've ever heard this parable before. Did I just not commit it to memory? Was it too confusing and contradictive to think about? So it is Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 13. The subheading on mine says, the parable of the shrewd manager. Depending on your translation, manager or steward might be the word your Bible uses. And then Jesus told his disciples this. There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, what is this I hear about you? Give me an account of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I am not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. So he called in each of his master's debtors, and he asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. The manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and let's make it 100. And then he asked the second, and how much do you owe? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. And he told him, take your bill, and let's call it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly in a wicked turn of events. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than they are the people of light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dealings. I'll be completely honest, I wish this passage didn't have verses 8 and 9 there, because I'm good until I get to those two sentences, and then I'm like, well, there it all. And I don't know what's going on. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. Okay, I understand that. And whoever is dishonest with very little is also dishonest with much. So if you have been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you the property of their own? No servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. There we go. Happy I've read that for the second time today. And I still have less understanding of what's going on than when I read it the first time. Luke 16 begins a string of teachings in the Gospel of Luke concerning materialism, money, resources, and what we do with materialism, money, and resources. And due to this theme, many lectionary churches today are traditionally starting stewardship campaigns. Has anybody ever been a part of a stewardship campaign? Do you know what I mean when I say the launching of a stewardship campaign? Anybody? No? No? Well, you have luckily dodged that bullet, and you'll continue to dodge it because I'm not going to do that to you. A stewardship campaign traditionally would be a sermon series talking about tithing and offering. And usually in a stewardship campaign, whether it be towards the end of the year or when a church is going through a building project, there are concerns and talks of people making pledges to the church and committing to give so much over the next year. That's what a stewardship campaign. It is traditionally conversations, sermons, and teaching about tithes and offerings. And I am not going to start one of those on you today, so don't be worried. You don't have to awkwardly think of a reason to get up and go to the bathroom and leave the church now. If you really didn't come here to talk about tithes and offerings, I don't blame you. There are a few things I really love in this world. And two of those things probably are this church and Carissa. And as I thought about this sermon this week and talking about stewardship concepts of this parable, I realized one of the reasons why I love this church and love Carissa in very similar ways. If you've asked me anything about my thoughts of money or budgets or long-term plans, I am lucky enough that I get to say this following answer. Carissa takes care of all of that. I don't have to worry or stress myself out about stuff, money, bills, budgets, long-term plans. It's not my thing. That's Carissa's thing, and she likes it being her thing. She has a passion for that, so I get to be completely hands-off in that regard and not have any worries, concerns, or opinions in that world, and I am at peace thinking about that. Probably also one of the main reasons why I love being in this church is I also have a Carissa here. Her name's just Janie, right? And Janie takes care of that. I don't have to worry or stress myself out about that. And I'm probably thankful to previous pastors that came in before that set up that way of doing things. Sean said it beautifully a handful of weeks ago. He said that in this church there's a belief that as the pastor you just handle the message, handle the Bible, and let the church handle the business of the church. And I am more than thankful that I don't have to get up here and hammer in business concepts, and hence I probably don't have to run point on stewardship campaigns. On that, I'm thankful to have people in my life that have taken up that responsibility, have set in those habits and practices already. So it's due to these Thanksgivings that this is not the beginning of a stewardship kickoff. But in a sense, that also frees me up, or maybe forces me into the responsibility of having to handle one of the more awkward, confusing, conflicting parables in all of the Gospels. This passage in Luke 16 is vague. It is misleading. And just when you begin to assume where it's going and you predict the outcome, it takes a hard U-turn and confuses you further. But what else would we expect from a challenging rabbi from Nazareth? Because while this passage is vague and confusing, there's a lot to be thought of. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of shoes that you can put yourself into as you read Luke 16. And we can put ourselves into those shoes without needing a definitive answer, without needing to know what the climax of the movie is going to be, without needing to know maybe the overarching answer to what the question is here. There are many, many shoes to inhabit. We have all at times struggled to balance or serve two or more masters. We've all buckled under that stress of prioritizing where you put the resources of your life. Or maybe at times we've had it all together and we've had the simple task of only having one master to serve. We have been faithful with very little. And at times we've probably also been faithful with very much. But if you're honest this morning, there are times where you have been unwise or shrewd or dishonest with very little. And there are probably times when you have been unwise, wasteful, or dishonest with very much. We have all been good managers in this story, but we also, if we're to be honest with ourselves, at times have been bad managers as well. We have had debts forgiven, and we have refused to forgive debts. We have all been fired from a job, or maybe you've been the one that has to do the firing. There's a lot of roles to inhabit and to think about in this story. So let's talk about the parable itself. The steward or manager is accused of being frivolous, unwise, or generally lacking as the placekeeper and the manager of the master's household. And it's right here where we begin to make assumptions. We begin to place people into boxes. We begin to identify the right and the wrong, the heroes and the villains. And so your first assumption might be to read these opening sentences of this parable and immediately assume that the master in this story is God. It's an easy assumption, but it might be lazy. If we're to be honest and think about how the master acts, is the master God in this metaphor? The master acts in many ways unlike our heavenly parent typically does. The master fires this steward, this manager, based solely on hearsay. The master doesn't truly investigate the matter. The master simply calls the manager or the steward in without giving him his day in court to tell him he will no longer be his manager anymore. The master in the opening sentences of this parable, for lack of a better term, is unforgiving. So my question to you is, if we immediately begin to assume that the master is God and we are the stewards, does the master act like God traditionally acts? And now questions arise of what next for this manager, for this steward. An inner monologue launches us into the alternatives that the manager lays out before him as he begins to step out into a world of unemployment. He thinks about all the things he can't do. Not strong enough for manual labor. I'm too proud to beg and ask for favors. And then he has an aha moment. He thinks of an option that will allow him hope for the future. He thinks of an option that basically will give him the ability to have favors he needs to cash in on at a later date. So he begins to take matters into his own hands. He begins to wheel and deal, albeit arbitrarily, under the table and ultimately at the expense of the master. Maybe it's a last-ditch effort to incur favor on the eve of his looming unemployment. But maybe there's something more at play. Maybe the master has been unforgiving in more ways than just being unforgiving to his manager. Maybe the master has been unforgiving in debts and interests. Maybe the steward has been the one faced with the unpleasant job of enforcing unfair, crippling interests upon these local families and local business owners. And maybe in his new, unemployed, liberated status, it frees him to right the wrongs that he had so recently enforced. See, there's a translation in this parable that believes that the discounts he cuts all these local business owners is he is just subtracting the interest on their loans. And if you look at what some of the original sums are and what the total paid out when he cuts this deal, think about what that interest rate is when you look at the bills of debt that they are freed from. And if we're honest about our overarching theme in the Bible at times, we know that God has always had specific ideas about loans and interests and how to handle debt and who is in debt to you. In fact, there's a practice in the Old Testament, and we don't actually ever know if God's people practiced this, but there was supposed to be a practice amongst the people of God that every 7 years there would be what they called the Day of the Lord, and every 7 years all debts were to be wiped out. That all bills and loans and bad decisions maybe people had made and gotten themselves between a rock and a hard place, every 7 years those were forgiven. And while there are scriptures that point to this is what God intended for God's people, we don't actually have proof if God's people ever practiced that command. If God's people ever practiced forgiving all debts every 7 years. In fact, there might have been times where God's people became too much like the world and practiced unfair indebtedness and unfair interest upon those who loaned them money. And if we think of it in that terms, it's not too much of a stretch to think that a master that would fire a manager only based on hearsay might also be a master that has heaped unfair interest upon others. And so the steward maybe sets out, being free from his job, to right the wrongs that he has been forced to enforce over these past few years. So he begins to forgive debts. He begins to wipe out interest. And then hope begins to emerge. Not only hope for his future, not only hope that when he is soon to be without a job, he might be able to go to these families he forgave and have a favor to cash in on, have a place to live and maybe a job to be handed out. Hope begins to emerge for the indebted families as well. Maybe being free from their debt allows them to think about their own futures and to think about long-term plans rather than simply living paycheck to paycheck. Maybe they're able to think about what they want to do over the next 6 to 12 months rather than laying down to sleep every night worried about this impossible bill they're trapped under. 800 gallons of olive oil. Does anybody here ever go buy olive oil at Kroger or Walmart, depending on where you procure your olive oil at, right? Okay. Olive oil always comes in like little bottles, right? And if you're honest, if you're like me, you just try to find what the cheapest bottle of olive oil is, you know, because you're going to fry it, whatever it is. Maybe that's bad cooking habits, you know. That's always the bigger bottle. Have you ever noticed, like, the cheaper bottle of olive oil is always the bigger? I can't imagine what the sum total on 800 gallons worth of olive oil would be. That's why I buy my olive oil at Costco. 800 gallons of olive oil. If that was the bill you were facing, you probably went to bed every night just stressed because every month you just saw that 800 number increase bit by bit. And being forgiven of that debt, being cut, what is it? Is it 800 down to 100? Is that what the total is? 400. Down to 400? Cuts the bill in half. If all of a sudden you were free and you were free by half of what you'd stressed out about over the past years of your life, hope would take root. Some find this translation of this parable to be incorrect because they find 50% interest to be unlawful and unpractical, even by some Far East standards of the time. But I think Jesus, more often than not in his parables, speaks in hyperbolic terms. Speaks in exaggerations to get the point across. And in that sense, the radical forgiveness of this parable makes sense for the Gospel of Luke. This fits the theme of the Gospel of Luke, and in reality it fits the theme of the Gospel of Isaiah. And maybe you've never heard the Gospel of Isaiah before. But it's interestingly enough that the ministry of Jesus Christ in the Gospel of Luke begins with him quoting a passage from Isaiah 61. Luke 4, verses 18 through 19, Jesus begins preaching in a synagogue, quoting that the day of the Lord will be known when there is freedom for the captives, good news for the poor, and sight to the blind. I need to keep my pages in order. I keep reading the wrong sentence. There was a time when the church, every once in a while, would find itself just surviving. Would find itself just living day to day and not thinking about the work they were doing. And there was a time when early church leaders would say that if they found churches kind of in that survival mode, when they were in doubt if they were doing God's work in the world, they would ask the question of, is the church telling a story that frees people? Is the church telling a story or doing work that is good news for the poor? Is it setting people free? And if it was, then it was doing the work of God. Maybe that's the message of this parable. To right wrongs, to set people free, to forgive now, to forgive for good reasons, maybe to forgive for selfish reasons, even if you're about to be fired, to give for all the right reasons, and maybe to forgive for wrong reasons as well, but ultimately to forgive. Because forgiveness is hope. And forgiveness is new beginnings no matter how you look at it. So the real question of this parable is, who is your master? Is your master the systems of this world that can be unforgiving at times? And the systems of this world can be good things. They can. Sometimes they can lure you in to a false sense of security. Or is your master this morning the God of the Gospel of Luke? The God of the Gospel of Luke 4. The God of the Gospel of Isaiah 61. See, maybe suddenly, as he walks out of that meeting, having been fired, that the manager realizes that he's lived his life for the past few years serving multiple masters, juggling multiple responsibilities and priorities, and just being okay at everything rather than good at any one thing. Is he just realizing what he has been saying yes to and no to all along? See, sometimes life tells us no. And then sometimes life telling us no, we realize what we should have been saying yes to all along. You've maybe heard that old parable that sits there and says that when a door closes, a few more open up. Have you ever had a door close on your life? And And in that moment you thought there was no other recourse, and that was the worst thing that ever could have happened to you. But in the days to come, you think about what you're freed up to do now that you're no longer going through that door, what the new possibilities might mean. To figure out what you're saying yes to and what you're saying no to, which masters you're serving. Do you have too much on your plate going on at once? Do you need to cut down on your load? There's an insightful strength and conditioning coach for the North Carolina Panthers now. And in many ways across the strength and conditioning community, Joe Ken is known as kind of one of the godfathers. He's been at Arizona State, he's been at Boise State, he's been with the Panthers now for over 10 years. And he says that often, more than not, that players will come into his office and they'll want to start doing something new. They'll have a suggestion, or they'll have gone to somebody else's gym and done a new type of workout, and they want to start, I want to add this into my program. And so the Joe Ken will commonly sit down and pull up their program on the computer and turn the screen around and say, okay, I hear you. So what are we getting rid of? If you want to add, you have to get rid of. That's a different narrative than what life traditionally tells you. Life traditionally tells you that you can just keep adding and adding and adding and adding. And have you ever done that and realized that your plate is too full? That there needs to be some forced subtraction? Some of you all will do that next week at potluck when we leave Fuller's. You'll push the limits of that little styrofoam plate to its very, very end capacity. It might not be too late till you realize you put too much on the plate. Maybe you've put too much on the plate of your life and stressed yourself out. Have you ever worked so hard to make yourself sick? Have you ever find yourself going, never saying no to anything? Or actually the only thing you're saying no to is sleep? And then all of a sudden your body says no for you for a span of time. How many masters are you serving? See, we are all managers. We are all stewards. We all have resources. And you might be sitting there this morning saying that you don't have resources. You do. Time, energy, money. You have resources. And these resources can reveal a lot about who we are. Because the way we use what we have reveals who we serve. It reveals who we have said yes to and who we have said no to. Most people encounter this passage and only preach or only think or only wrestle with those last few sentences. What does it mean to be faithful in a lot and faithful in a little? If you've been faithful with a little, you can be faithful with a lot. If you can be trusted with a little, you can be trusted with a lot. All things matter, little and small. So most of us this week won't cross huge milestones. We won't christen a ship. We won't write a book. We won't end a war. We won't appoint a new cabinet. We won't dine with royalty. We won't convert a whole nation. We won't die a martyr. Most likely this week will only present us with a few small chances. Chances like a chance to give a cup of water. A chance to write a thank you note. A chance to visit a friend or vote for a local official. A chance to teach a Sunday school class. A chance to make time to share a meal. Tell a child a story. Go to choir practice. Or feed a neighbor's cat while they're out of town and they need some help. But the end of the story is whoever has been faithful with very little will also be faithful with very much. Who is your master this morning? How many are you serving? And if you can start to say no to a few masters and free up your hands a little, what new rights and freedom could you give out to others in your midst? Amen.
Number 353. I know from my family.
Which masters are you serving? Which masters are you committed to this morning? What are you saying yes and know to as a manager of this life in the now. Amen.
Amen.
So, quick 2 things on the, well, 3 things. I take that back. So tonight, we have charge conference here at 6, as the district superintendent comes through and we set for the next year. So that's tonight here at Dowelltown at 6, because we're the easy of the 3 churches to find. Unless I feel like really throwing a curveball and saying we'll have it in Pisgah and see how lost somebody gets. But so we'll have it here at 6 o'clock tonight at Dowelltown. Donna really is great, and some of the insight she brings as a great Old Testament scholar is very powerful as a leader of this church in this district. Then Wednesday night this week, we're going to have some fun here in the house. We're going to have, is it shaved ice? Am I saying that correctly? What will be the right?
Well, snow cones.
Snow cones. All right, so we're going to have some snow cones and some rec time here Wednesday night, depending on, I mean, if it's good outside, the weather's great outside. Of course, we hadn't rained in what feels like 2 months, so I don't know why we're all of a sudden like the weather's not going to be good. We'll be outside. If not, we'll be inside and having fun and eating snow cones. I don't know about you. Maybe you want to find out how much snow cones you can put on your plate. In that sense, and then next Sunday at 11, we have homecoming and 5th Sunday over at Fuller's. Part of me wanted that to be this morning, as I stayed up late watching football last night. I was like, man, it'd be nice if I could sleep until 9 tomorrow. But it's next week. So next week is service at 11 at Fuller's.